Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Anne Speckhard, Director of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism. She previously served for over 2 decades as Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine, as well as an affiliate in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. She has interviewed over 800 terrorists, their family members, and supporters in various parts of the world, including in Western Europe, the Balkans, Central Asia, the former Soviet Union, and the Middle East, and has also been training key stakeholders in law enforcement, intelligence, educators, and other countering violent extremism professionals on the use of counter-narrative messaging materials both locally and internationally. In this episode, Alon and Anne discuss the rise in violent extremism and the causes behind it, the prospects of political violence in the U.S., the role of social media in promoting violent extremism and terrorism, and how violent extremist movements in the Middle East may evolve in relation to current events.
So, you have elaborated extensively on the rise of violent extremism. Just for the sake of our listeners, to what do you attribute this rise? You enumerated a number of reasons behind it. And the second question that I would love to follow, what are the initial steps? What kind of steps can be taken to prevent? You are talking about prevention, obviously, you're talking about rehabilitation, you're talking about various aspect dimension, but in particular, which is of great interest to me, is the fact that the majority of those who deal with conflict resolution, with rise of violent extremism, neglect something that you emphasize, which is critical, and that's the psychological dimension of this phenomenon. So let me begin then by asking the first question in terms of where do you see the rise, the rationale, the causes behind the rise of violent extremism?
Okay, well, Alon, I've studied, I've interviewed over 800 terrorists, and 54 of them were not really terrorists, but violent extremists. So they were white supremacists, oath keepers, violent Proud Boys, KKK, that sort of thing. But terrorists are also violent extremists, and we're seeing the rise on both sides. And if we're talking about militant jihadi terrorism, we're seeing a rise in that in response to world events and people's despair and selling Islam as an answer. But if we're talking about white supremacism and militia movements, we're seeing that in Western democracies, and particularly right now in the US. And that has to do with people not believing in the system and thinking that there's a better way, people being taught to hate others and to view others as trying to replace them, to take their jobs, to harm them in some way, a lot of conspiracy theories. And sadly, in the US right now, a lot of those are even being repeated by government officials. I get fundraising emails for both the right and the left. And some of the emails from the Trump campaign for things that the administration wants right now talk about white replacement theory. It's coded a bit, so it's like a dog whistle, but they talk about that immigrants are flooding this country and that there's actually a plan to do that so that liberals like George Soros can take over and run everything, which is basically white replacement theory, that the Jews are trying to use immigrants to destroy the white race and get some kind of control over the government. I mean, these people talk about Zog as the Zionist control of the government, and they're talking about in the US.
Right, and obviously, as you have alluded and said, Trump himself contributes quite a bit to this whole discourse that is taking place. Let me begin with the United States. Where do you see this going? And to what extent you think that he and the government, the MAGA movement, will be able to establish a sort of permanent inroad that is going to actually create? I mean, some people are even talking about potential civil war that may result because of the Trump's policy. how do you see that evolve the next year or two based on what we are witnessing nowadays?
Well, the talk of civil war was mostly from the people that are in these extremist movements, militia movements. They're very worried about gun control. They're worried, they want to stand up for Fourth Amendment rights, which is the ownership of guns. They believe in militia movements. They think that the government's too big and going to take over. So right now, they're getting what they want because Elon Musk is gutting the government. Trump is talking to their concerns. And they are a substantial part of his support, unfortunately. So I doubt that we get a civil war from them. But I did make interviews with some former military that were of this thinking or had been of this thinking, but had rehabilitated. And they said that they fell into white supremacist movements. They were taught to hate. One guy that comes to mind was a drug addict, couldn't get a job, couldn't hold a job. He finally got hired by a group of white supremacists. And instead of saying to him, look, your problems in your marriage and your work life, they all stem from you're a drug addict. You're ruining your own life. Instead, they said it's all the immigrants. It's, they're trying to harm you. And when he explained it after he'd gotten out of it and cleaned himself up drug-wise, was, if you're doing things that destroy your own life, but you don't want to face those, it's a really handy thing to have a group tell you and constantly confirm to you it's not you, it's somebody else. And then that deepens your hatred for this outside group. And he was a part of the military, and he said that he really thought that we would come to a civil war and it would be over gun rights and over these sort of things. The white supremacists talk about it all the time of an apocalyptic day when there's, and Trump talked about a day of reckoning, QAnon talked about a day of reckoning. And for the white supremacists, it means that they round up everybody that they consider an enemy. They either deport them or kill them, or they create spaces in the U.S. where they can live basically sequestered from the rest of us. But it's kind of funny because some of these white supremacists that I interviewed, as time went on in their trajectory, they got disillusioned of white supremacism because hate doesn't get you very far. And they started, two of them found out that one was, I think, Cherokee. Another one found out he had Black relatives. And, it's kind of funny because race is a social construct. I mean, most of us are mixed in various ways. So, thinking that you're so great because you're white, sometimes is a fallacy and an extreme one in their cases, because they weren't even what a white supremacist would declare as white.
So what we are witnessing, do you expect, obviously this is going to continue. I mean, as long as President Trump is in power, he would probably remain relentless in his advocacy of directly and indirectly of white supremacy and all the other steps that he has taken. That is in fact encouraging this kind of group in militia to do pretty much what they been hoping to be able to do. Do you expect any kind of backlash coming, and from what corners that might come? That is, in the final analysis, that is the United States of America, we still have a constitution, we still have some kind of, the balance of power between the branches now is being blurred quite a bit. Do you see any prospect for backlash and where that might come from and in which form?
That's a good question. And we definitely already have backlash. I ended up making 6 Antifa interviews, all people that were violent in Antifa. And the right likes to claim that Antifa is the problem. But what it was all the violence that they talked to me about. These people are very hard to interview. They don't agree to interviews very often. But I got 6 to talk to me, and they were all involved. A number of them were willing to attack fake abortion clinics. and churches that were against abortion rights. And what they would do is they would smash all the windows. In the case of the fake abortion clinics, there's these crisis pregnancy centers that churches have, and they advertise in a questionable manner. So you don't know, you go in for a pregnancy test and think you might possibly be able to get an abortion, and they're extremely against abortion and try to talk you out of it. And so these people were burning those clinics. They just destroyed them completely. And then they would write in red paint, you won't be safe until we're safe, and things about abortion rights. So we saw a backlash when the courts started outlawing abortion, and we're seeing more and more repression with abortion. I don't know who said it, but a governor of one state, I believe, it was last week, I heard it from a friend, that there was a quote about women can freely travel, but if they're pregnant when they leave the state that doesn't allow abortion, when they come back, they better still be pregnant. And, that's harking back to Romania and Ceausescu, when he forced women to keep their pregnancies. And, I don't know if we'll ever get that repressive, but, people that are against abortion believe it's murder. They believe in life from conception. And people that want abortion rights are willing to engage in violence. The Antifa people told me, we don't do violence. Well, they said punch a MAGA in the face and punch a Nazi in the face. They totally endorsed. And they said, if someone's a fascist, you should attack that person physically, which was interesting to hear from Antifa because they're so against, government fascism. But, they did endorse violence in that case, but they definitely endorsed property violence and said that it was not terrorism. And that they didn't even consider it violence. They considered it legitimate protest. So we're going to see backlash from Antifa, and we're already seeing it on reproductive rights. Now that we're seeing these deportations, I don't know what will happen. I think immigrant and green card holders are scared. I just went to a cardiologist that's a green card holder, and he's from Belgium, and he told me, I no longer post anything. I'm just very, very careful what I say. I don't want anything to happen to my status. And, we've had scientists coming into the US and being sent home after their phones are scrutinized. My daughter-in-law from Austria is coming this week, and I keep meaning to call them and say, check everything off your phones that you've said against Trump. Because you can be denied access to the country, entry to the country, and called terrorist because you've written things privately to your friends in text messages saying that you're against Trump. I don't think any of those people are likely to be violent. I think the illegal immigrants are just going to try to stay below the radar. But certainly these kinds of policies, when we have this Maryland man that was sent to El Salvador, and the Trump administration is just saying they don't have to listen to the judge and they don't have to return him. The president of El Salvador just announced after meeting with Trump that he's not going to send him back. He views him as a terrorist. And so this emboldens white supremacist groups to attack those people and mislabel them. I mean, most of the Hispanics, people from South America, Central America, Mexico, are running this country. They're building their homes, doing the agriculture sector. But I don't think you will see among liberals people organizing and buying guns. Although I have to say, Antifa, every one of them told me we started arming. And this is before Trump came back into power. But when they saw the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers coming to demonstrations with their guns, remember during COVID?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so then they said, we're applying for gun permits. But I think on the liberal side, you're going to see fights in the court. You're going to see money donated, but I don't think you're going to see political violence.
That is for the foreseeable future, or in terms of longer term from your perspective?
It depends how bad it gets. I mean, people are
Yeah.
talking about that we're entering into a fascist state.
Yeah.
And when we don't have the balance of powers anymore, when the court can be ignored by the administration, when Congress either chooses not to act or also is ignored, I still don't think the liberals are going to raise up for violence, but you'll see street protests and things like that. I guess, I mean, this is something that could be a false flag kind of thing. With all these protests, they're increasing in numbers now. If they plant them with thugs, which is a common thing for fascist leaders to do, and then get violent towards them, there might be clashes, and then that would lead the state to say that it's an emergency and that they need to move to emergency powers and even consolidate more power and use more force. But I
Right.
still don't see, I don't see the majority of political violence coming from that side. I think that we will definitely embolden militia movements, brown shirt types.
I mean, these are, of course, the manifestation of what we are seeing. We are listening to the narrative. And because since you dwell also on the psychological aspect of the rise of extremism, violent extremism, where do you see that in this evolving phenomena right here in the United States? That is, what are the psychological aspects of that from your perspective?
Well,
And just one more thing to add to that, that is ultimately, that is what it is. Suppose they've been able to get what they want. What sort of picture do they envision to have for this country? That is, to start with the psychological dimension of it, and leading into, suppose they are able to, but this is a separate question. We can deal with that a little later.
sure. Well, Alon, when I made about 400 interviews of terrorists, people asked me what makes a terrorist. And I thought, oh, what a good question. And, looking back over those 400 and now it's 800, I thought, well, what's the necessary and sufficient causes of someone to become violent for political reasons? And I think there's almost always a group. There's an ideology that justifies it, because people won't be violent against innocents unless they can somehow justify it. And then there's social support, and then there's what's in the individual vulnerabilities. I call that the lethal cocktail of terrorism. So if we look at violent extremism coming from white supremacist militia movements, certainly there's lots of groups available. There's an ideology. The ideology is white replacement. There's conspiracy theories about the government trying to control guns and the necessity to stockpile, and that Jews are trying to take over. I mean, that's been going on for at least 100 years, these conspiracy theories. And then they're still out there, and they're being repeated. As I told you, I get fundraisers that talk about, immigrants are flooding the country, and there's individuals that want to use this to hurt the white race and to hurt the prospects of our future. So their vision becomes something we have to get those immigrants out of the country. We have to get these bad elements out. We have to go back to some vision of whiteness and greatness, masculinity, a really strong division between masculine and feminine roles. And again, we have to say masculinity and femininity are social constructs. But these people believe that if you're masculine, according to their definition, that makes you male and the other makes you female. And they're completely against transgender rights, LGBT. They're very worried that there's grooming of their kids. And this is something that will move people to violence. I think the liberal movement made a mistake in going a bit too far on transgender without scientific evidence that changing the body is a good idea. And Trump played that to the hilt. And it plays in the conservative movement of, the school will try to turn your child to a different gender. This will be done without your knowledge. But anyway, so they want to go back, and there's Christian nationalists that want to go back to what they view as fundamental values. The funny thing is, Christianity really is based on love and compassion and mercy for other people, and sharing and not being selfish. But they're playing more upon sex roles, fundamentalist Christian definitions. And that's their vision, to be a Christian white nation, to get rid of everyone else, and for men to ascend to power, and women to get back in the kitchen. And women can have a certain amount of power, but it's definitely a male-dominated vision. And this plays to people. I mean, when we talk about the fourth element in the lethal cocktail of terrorism, it plays to people that have lost their roles. Maybe their dads were factory workers and that factory doesn't exist anymore. And they're a white guy that's not getting ahead, maybe has a Walmart job or no job at all, or just a laborer, but is seeing immigrants competing with him and blames it on the immigrants instead of on the larger social forces that are happening in our country. And when I interviewed our sample, it was only 54, but I was completely amazed at the adverse childhood experiences they had. Parents never married, parents doing drugs, they themselves doing drugs, horrible violence, abuse. And these kind of things make you really vulnerable to needing to belong to something, to having some kind of personal significance and mission in life. I mean, they're basically people filled with fear and threatened all the time. So when they organize themselves under some conspiracy theory or hate theory, it gives them a sense of, I'm better than you. Mm-hmm. And I should have these things, and you're the one standing in the way. And unfortunately, they don't look at the really higher level social forces that are going on, which is this country has consolidated a lot of wealth to the upper classes. Our middle class is disappearing. Has nothing to do with whiteness or blackness, has nothing to do with religion, has to do with, is everybody having a fair chance, and the rich getting richer on the backs of the ordinary people.
I mean, this is what we are currently witnessing. Obviously, Trump is adding a fuel, so to speak, to the fire. But nevertheless, these groups remain, as far as I know, a minority. And they're certainly not the majority of the American public. So to what extent you think it will continue to expand, or is there going to be a point in time where like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be some sort of backlash. There's going to be that through the courts, be that through demonstrations, through civil disobedience, whatever it might take, in order to arrest the growth of this kind of movement. Do you see that happening? And then I'm going to switch to outside the United States.
Sure. I did see that happening, that we were going to see these kind of movements in the US, because the FBI was saying it's the biggest internal threat in the US. This is before Trump got elected. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department were standing up a lot of programs to do prevention. So let's say, you have this vulnerable group of people that have grown up in families that don't really exist. They need to belong to something. They're providing alternatives, providing counseling to them. They were also trying to do exit programs so that people could leave these groups and be supported. That's a really common thing in Europe, but we haven't had that in the US yet. But DHS and Justice was supporting it. We had some grants to teach the police how to even recognize people that are vulnerable and deal with them, how to address hate crimes and try to prevent hate crimes. But almost all of these programs are being wiped out under Trump. Right. So So we're not having prevention efforts anymore. And we're also having an administration that looks like it wants to consolidate power to itself. Trump's talking about even having another term. And so if he's in power for the next, he's only been a short time, 4 years, we don't know where that's going to lead, but certainly these groups that were small, and they can still cause a lot of problems when they're small. I mean, you think about
Of course.
11, it was only 17 hijackers, and they changed the world. And so I think that these groups are going to be emboldened. All the January 6th, I would call them terrorists. I mean, they attacked our public building and tried to stop election results. That's political violence. They were released, and some of them are already up to new criminal acts. But the Trump administration seems to want to use these type of people. And remember Trump telling the Proud Boys, stand back, but be ready. And so if he continues in power for a long time, even 4 years, we may see these grow, and we may see people doing crimes that should be prevented and stopped, but are encouraged. And I mean, every fascist state uses thugs and brown shirts, right?
Yeah. I mean, certainly this is very troubling. I deal from my end not with conflict resolution. As I see it, any attempt on my part to try to find a resolution to our conflict, I feel sometimes a bit lost. But like yourself, myself, we don't give up. We have to continue the fight no matter what happens. So I want to take this, you mentioned much for your writing other the causes, of course, the social media role and propagating violent extremism. Let's talk a little about that and what can be done from your perspective. Needless to say, these big companies, be that Google, Apple, I mean, they have not been able to, particularly I would say Facebook, Twitter, and all of that, Instagram, they're not being really careful and certainly not been watching exactly what is being the content of all of the things that have been written, which is a great deal of misinformation being spread all over. And they're doing very little to arrest that, to stop that, to inhibit people from doing so. Where do you see that happening, going? Because, this is one source today, accessible to just about anybody and everyone who wants to use it for ill reasons, for malice reasons. And to me, this is one of the greatest, biggest problems that we are facing today in terms of the expansion, spread of extremism, both in the United States and, of course, as well as other parts of the world. Where do you see that further happening? What can be done, if anything, to try to, because this is one source that is probably more than any other source, is spreading this through misinformation. What we are seeing, the rise of extremism both outside and inside the United States, and certainly contributing to the rise of right of center throughout the world in so many different countries.
Well, we have already had a massive social experiment with ISIS. So ISIS was the first terrorist group that really realized that they could use social media, and they used it quite effectively, and that they no longer needed journalists. So if you remember the terrorist attack in Moscow where the Chechens took over the theater, they prepared a tape and they presented it to Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera aired it for them. I think Al Jazeera even, it was NTV, came into the theater and talked to some of the terrorists. But they required regular media to interact with them. But ISIS, because social media came into being, they got good filmmakers, fair filmmakers, video. They got good at video, they got good at propaganda, which most terrorist groups already were. And they just started putting it out on the social media. And in the social experiment, what we learned was that if you blanket social media with ideas, then you can just sit back and see who likes your ideas. And then you can swarm in on that person because you get a feedback. You know, if you put something out on your Facebook, your Twitter, or I guess it's X now, whatever you do, you get feedback who likes it. And then you can start talking to that person. And if you're a terrorist group or violent extremist group, you can find out what does that person need. So, you know, the fourth thing, what are your vulnerabilities? What do you need? And start giving it to them. And you can create a circle around that person. So I always say, if you have a phone, you have social support for terrorism.
Yeah.
Because you can fall into a large group. And then you start to think, well, everyone thinks like me, and it's correct. So this whole social mirroring that goes on when we decide how to act. I mean, we decide how to dress by looking around at, you know, what's appropriate dress, how to talk, how to act. And we can also decide these violent actions are justified if we're surrounded by a group that tells us that they are and that we'll be a hero if we engage in them. So we already know that that's what happens with social media. And all the big four giants, Google, Microsoft, Twitter at the time, and Facebook all decided together to do hashes on all the ISIS material and help the smaller social media companies to delete them. So they got on top of that. But I can tell you that I've interviewed people that went into ISIS, that they were having crises in their lives. They were confused about what they should do, which is, I just told you, all these white supremacists and militia members came from terribly chaotic homes. They fall into this stream, and they were reading Facebook and Twitter and saying, oh, the Islamic State, it's good. And sure, they're killing journalists, but they're telling us those journalists are lying to us and are Islamophobic, and they're building up a great state. Well, the same thing is going to happen if, and now Trump has allowed, and I think even asked Facebook, Google, I mean, they're basically pledging allegiance to him and giving him money, and they've pedaled way back on their safety measures. Because I've worked with Facebook as a consultant, and they've done a very good job of public safety and deleting things right away that could lead to someone falling down a rabbit hole and going into violent extremism. But now they've pedaled back on that and said, you know, we're no longer going to hire people to do some of those functions. And so I think we'll see the social experiment repeated, that people will go down rabbit holes and the extremist movements will put their materials out on social media and just wait to see who responds and then recruit those people. And not all of them will be recruited, but a lot of them can be. And we know that with militant jihadism, more and more ISIS, groups like ISIS, are getting young kids, even children, to carry terrorist attacks. And, you know, you can play on somebody if you, I mean, look, right now we're talking intimately. I can see you, you know, get a feel for who you are. And if we talked daily for a month, you know, maybe you could talk me into something. And, you know, if I'm vulnerable, for sure. And, you know, people use romantic ties. They use, I can make you significant. I can make you important. I can help you escape your bad life. You can be a hero. You're going to be lauded by everyone. And, you know, all of us are vulnerable. Our egos are fragile, and we, you know, want to be told that we're good and we belong.
Yeah, and of course, adding that the power of repetition. I mean, particularly take a Trump, for example, the fact that he keeps repeating the same lies time and again and never relent, eventually sunk into the minds, the psyche of the American public, at least those who eventually turned out and voted for him. That is repeating
Also,
the same lies time and again. It becomes a truth as far as they are concerned. I mean, that is another aspect of the how the social media actually is promulgating this phenomenon.
And also our news stations. I mean, we have Fox that is a mouthpiece for him, and you know, people that are very smart working for them, and you know, even lawyers that are some of their top journalists, and you know, speaking, repeating his lies, as you say, justifying his actions, and with disinformation now, like when he announced that we were having reciprocal tariffs, some economists went back and said, no, those are not the tariffs that other countries are charging us. Here's how they did the math, and it's wrong. But if you're just an ordinary person, you don't know who to believe. So, you know, if you're consuming your news from Fox and Fox is telling you, no, his numbers are correct. I mean, it's very hard now to judge misinformation and to, you know, see for yourself what's correct. And, you know, it's getting better and better that you can even, you know, show false pictures, false video, false voices. And with AI, it's just going to get crazy. And so what I'm finding is a lot of Americans, at least, tell me, I just try to stay out of it. I don't watch the news. I don't want to know. And, you know, kind of a dissociative protection mechanism, which doesn't bode well for the country, because we all do need to be awake and weighing these things and saying, are they good for us? And are the lies that say, oh, this is going to be great, you're going to get a huge tax rebate, you know, you're going to get all these things, and they don't materialize. And again, the rich get richer and nobody else benefits. That's no good.
You know, I also see in watching, anyone been watching MSNBC or CNN before the election, and was one observation I made. In fact, I wrote to the station and said, the fact that they kept fixated on Trump for 4 years before the election, from the time he lost throughout the Biden administration, you could not put the TV on without saying Trump, 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 Trump. And this is something that this guy capitalized, like many others could, is negative or positive coverage, as long as his name is in the picture, as long as his name is being repeated time and again. And I think so the liberal media, so to speak, probably contributed just as much to his victory in the end than the conservative media, because they made him front and center in every single podcast for 4 years before the election. I mean, do you subscribe to that notion to some extent?
I don't know. It's possible. I mean, certainly he does capitalize on good news, bad news. I would say on the liberal side, liberals like to think that they're free thinkers and open-minded, but I see some fascist tendencies there as well. And particularly on the transgender issue of, you know, you have to agree with this. And I don't see scientific support for that particularly. And, you know, if you show me the science support, I'll agree with it. But I think, interesting, because then I can see the backlash to that, to go to the conservative movements. And I think that was a mistake on the side of liberal movements. I also think CNN in particular, I don't know about MSNBC, it seemed to get very editorial. So, you know, I could watch that as a liberal and think, am I watching news? And, you know, so I can imagine as a conservative, you just say that's not news and go back to Fox. And, you know, we need something that's more in the middle, but our country is getting split into these poles and very extremist on both ends and demanding of the other to agree with them, where, you know, we should be able to coexist in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, before we run out of time, I just want to take us a little bit outside the United States. You've written extensively about the rise of ISIS, what's happening in more in a present time, and of course the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza and what's happening in Gaza itself as a result of the Israeli massive retaliation that resulted in horrific death and destruction in that area. obviously it has had now, and I deal with this on a regular basis because that's my field, specifically in Middle Eastern studies, conflict resolution. And I see that the phenomena has, without any question, further accelerated the movement of jihadis outside, specifically in the Middle East and the Balkans and elsewhere. Where do you see that is going, given the continuing instability in the region and the continuing actually conflict, that violent conflict that's going on? That is the extent to which, of course, that war contributed to the further rise of jihadism movement around the world, specifically in this area that we mentioned earlier.
Well, I think ISIS really discredited militant jihadism because they were so brutal, and they didn't help the Syrian people. But on the other side, as long as we're seeing repression in Middle Eastern countries, Muslim-dominated Middle Eastern countries, people are going to turn to whatever they believe can bring them justice. And it's really natural to look at Islam as a bringer of justice. But then that opens the door for terrorist groups that manipulate Islam and claim that Islam allows for terrorism to come and grow in power. The situation in Gaza is fueling that because Israel-Palestine has been a lightning rod forever for groups like Al-Qaeda. And when the incursion happened from Gaza into Israel, we can argue why that happened. But once it did happen, I think most reasonable people said, that's pretty horrific. It shouldn't have happened. But the backlash is so awful, and the civilian death toll is so awful, that that's what plays across Middle Eastern countries, even with really moderate Muslims, to be supporting Palestine and to say that Israel is committing war crimes, calling Israel a terrorist. And, they don't even look back to what kicked it off. And so that concerns me. I think, we've seen people trying to attack synagogues and attack Jewish people, and successfully doing so in Europe. So it would be good to remove that fuel, to rebuild Gaza, stop the war, and somehow turn it around that killing that many civilians is no longer justified. But, I wish the Mossad would have gone after the Hamas leaders. The Mossad is so good, instead of doing this kind of action where so many, I think we have to say, if it's, between 30,000, 60,000, right? I don't know what the numbers are, a large majority of those people are not Hamas leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an awful development, and I don't see as of now how that is going to end, given the nature of the Israeli government, which is, from my perspective, is a fascist as it can get. And so it is a sad phenomenon. I just want to ask you one other question. When we look at various conflicts today, specifically in the Middle East and many other places, they involve, majority of them involve Muslims. If we look at the Sudan, I'm not making any, alluding to anything other than just it's a phenomenon. And I wonder if you have had a take from a psychological perspective why it is. You see the conflict in the Sudan, of course, the Syria going on for so many years has continued, and in so many different places where the Muslim are killing Muslim, basically, for whatever reason. Everyone has their own rationale, their own reasons. Do you see any common denominator? Do you see any, from a psychological perspective, why is it there's so much conflict within these communities versus others, specifically in the last 15, 20, 30 years?
I think in the Middle East and the Muslim majority countries, there's been just terrible repression. There have been, the masses don't have opportunities. There's a privileged few, and anybody that tries to go against it ends up being treated horribly, tortured, killed. And you've seen Muslims in various countries, Egypt, Iraq, you've seen them hark to different ideologies. So Marxism first, that this will save us. And, it's progressed to Islam will save us. But as long as the people have no hope, as long as they're afraid, I mean, when the people went to the streets in Baghdad to protest about the electricity and the corruption, they were shot from the top of the buildings by the government snipers. And, so when somebody goes home from that, what do they turn to? And so we should expect that they would turn to their religion. And anybody that exploits their religion and tells them, you should come and join this movement that will be violent against the government, that will overthrow the government, we should just expect that. I mean, the truth is, Islam doesn't say those things. Islam says boycott unrighteous government, stand against it in peaceful ways, and so on. But, that's not legitimate jihad in Islam, to create terror movements. But people believe it because they're not well educated in Islam. And Islam is not completely clear in the way that it, I mean, there's this whole issue of abrogation, and the terrorist groups say all these more peaceful and restraints on carrying out terrorist movements have been abrogated, they're removed. And you can do these things. And, what's a layman to say to that?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, what we see, of course, is the pervasiveness of these things. And it doesn't seem that, I don't see any end in sight in terms of the internal strife within the various Arab countries that's been going on for some time, and will continue to go on. And of course, the general, what I see on a global scale, this whole movement toward the right, what's happening in the United States, the final thoughts from your perspective. I mean, do you see sort of a culmination of all of this? Do you see that dissipating over time? Do you see it culminating into an explosion? Or we're going to have to live with it for decades to come?
I think there's all kinds of things happening. I mean, we have this former al-Nusra, what's his name, al-Shara in Syria, coming to power, and everybody forgiving him for his past, although watching him cautiously. And, if he brings a moderate Islamic State to Syria, and already that's just creating hope and resolution in other countries. I mean, Iraqis are subject to horrible corruption. I've been told that the property values in Baghdad are higher than anywhere in the world. And I don't know about you. Do you want to move to Baghdad? I mean, it's not exactly a destination.
I lived in Baghdad when I was a little boy.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe you want to buy property there. But
we had to abandon it when we left.
Yeah,
we couldn't sell it. We had to abandon our house completely and just leave. Yes.
Well, if you could get it back, it would be very valuable because the corrupt government officials are buying property and putting their money laundering by buying property. And, if the people can't live, if they can't even get an apartment, eventually it's going to explode. But it might explode to a people's movement of saying, we want what Syrians have, and we're willing to go that way, but we don't want to get behind a group like ISIS. And I think people in Iraq certainly learned their lesson from ISIS. They don't want that anymore. So it's interesting. And we're also seeing that in some Muslim majority countries, because of ISIS, a lot of people gave up Islam. And although that'd be more Iraq and Syria, people that were directly affected. So I don't know. And, if anybody can broker peace, God bless the Qataris for continuing to try. And I think Qatar is a really cool country that way, that, they put their money and their effort behind trying to create peace and the people's will in countries. I mean, a lot of people didn't like what they did in Egypt, but they said that was what the people wanted. And, if we could get these moderate Muslim states where Islam was followed to a certain degree, because Islam is trying to promote justice. If you look at, Islam from a more scholarly perspective, if you look at it from the perspective of the terror group, you should be afraid of it, but otherwise, no. And so I think it depends. It depends in our country whether people go to the streets in peaceful movements and refuse to engage in political violence, even if it turns out that they're planted with thugs and violence is done to them. I worry about a false flag attack in the US, that would be a really smart thing to do for anybody that wants to consolidate.
So you say you worry about?
A false flag attack, or else knowingly allowing a terrorist attack to happen, because that would be a great excuse to claim emergency powers by the administration. I hate to be that cynical that could happen, but it could. I mean, we've seen that in the past. I mean, wasn't it Hitler that burned not him himself, but his guys that burned the Reichstag, Erdogan, I don't remember what was attacked, but they had the coup attempt and
yeah, 2016. I mean, some said it was actually been fabricated. I mean, I lived that period, very much involved in Turkish affairs at the time, and I still feel that might have been fabricated altogether.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we see people consolidating their power by either allowing or fabricating attacks. And I worry about that in the US, because that would be a justification. Like we see Trump right now send the military down to the southern border. We never did that before. And as far as I know, I'm not a historian. But so, it kind of depends. But, if good thinking people are speaking out, if we continue to give courage to one another to stand up for justice, and we do it peacefully, hopefully we'll win. But
I hope so. Sorry.
Internationally, we have to give peace and hope to all of these people. I mean, Palestinians, what's happened in Gaza, it's so horrible. And that's just going to fuel violence everywhere. So.
Well, we have to hope. I mean, we have to push those of us who believe in peace, and we have no choice. We cannot give up, and I'm not going to give up. Nobody, it will be, I'm sure. I wish you have more time to talk about it. I'd love to speak about it, taking some leaders, getting into the mindset of various leaders like Trump, like Erdogan, like Netanyahu, Orban, where they come from, and what makes them tick. I think them all tick.
We could talk about
anyway. I would love some time we can talk about that. Again, Anne, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. All the best. Thank you again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.